Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And I'm sure the title of this video is a clue, but I am making a start on the promises that I made in the last video, which I'll be leaving linked in a card. In that video, I made mention of the fact that I am aware that I have been remiss, that I have not got a video dedicated to each of the wives of Henry VIII on this channel, and that I knew that this would never do. I still need to cover Katherine of Aragon, but today we're looking at Jane Seymour. I wonder if it's possible to uncover, excavate, or perhaps shape an idea of Jane that goes beyond what we perhaps think of her in the first case, something slightly more multifaceted, something that isn't, I think, obscured by the veil of Henry's love for her. And that love, I think, is principally there because she did what he wanted. She helpfully gave him a son, and that appeased him. And perhaps even more helpfully for her legacy, if not for her life, she then passed away before she could make any further demands or annoy him. But to find out more, I think we need to look at her, or at least what we know of her. So, let's go. Although more recent explorations have challenged and attempted to counter it, the wives of Henry VIII are frequently remembered, imagined and or reimagined in fairly archetypal and, I would say, reductive ways. Perhaps it's because there were 6 of them. That old rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, well, I don't think that helps much either. The rhyme is too easy to remember, and I think an unintended result is that these real, distinct women have become, for some at least, nameless, and principally defined by their fates in relation to their most famous husband. When their names have been listed, they are also often remembered alongside a singular reductive trait: the wronged wife, the temptress, the obedient one, the ugly one, the tart, and the nursemaid. Now, in fairness, I think we can argue that Jane doesn't do much to help herself and her legacy by choosing bound to obey and serve as her personal motto as queen. When this motto is coupled with Jane's early death, itself a result of giving Henry his heart's desire of a legitimate son and heir to follow him on the throne, I think the idea of her as the ideal wife, who would do all that was expected of her even if it meant her own death, gained rock-solid foundations. But what do we know, or rather think we know, about the woman herself? We know very little about Jane's early life and education. She and her siblings claimed a lineage that included King Edward III. As such, Jane is a distant cousin of her future husband, King Henry VIII. Some have suggested that this is what motivated the couple to seek Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's dispensation for them to marry. This dispensation was dated to the day of Anne Boleyn's execution, the 19th of May, 1536. However, the third and third degrees of affinity mentioned here refers to a relationship of a closer degree than that was shared by Henry and Jane. To my calculations, they are 5th cousins. This has led some to suggest that this dispensation is actually a reference to her future husband's sexual relations with Mary and Anne Boleyn. Mary and Anne were distant cousins of Jane Seymour, albeit not as distant as Henry was. Jane was born in around 1508, most likely at her family home of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire. She was one of 10 children and the eldest daughter. Sadly, 3 of her brothers and a sister died relatively young, or at least before they had the chance to get married. The scholar Barrett L. Beer suggests that Jane was probably taught by her father's chaplain at Wolf Hall, before proceeding to assert that most contemporaries agree that she was above average in intelligence. Further to this, Elizabeth Norton explains that In the 19th century, a story arose that she, Jane, had spent time in France, first in the household of Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and then with Mary's stepdaughter Claude. This claim is apparently based on the identification of a portrait in the Louvre as Jane. Unfortunately, it has no basis in fact, and it is clear that Jane never left England. What is more likely is that she received a basic education at Wolf Hall from the family chaplain. There is evidence that Jane was able to read and write, and she had at least some understanding of French and perhaps a little Latin. This was the extent of Jane's education, and she received the solid teaching befitting a future country gentlewoman, rather than that of a great lady in the making. So perhaps Jane does have an educational deficit when she is compared to Catherine or Anne. But it's worth bearing in mind that both Catherine and Anne are the exceptions rather than the rule when it comes to female education of the time. It would therefore be a mistake to tar Jane with the brush of stupidity, that she is some kind of naive bumpkin from the country. Time and money was spent on educating Jane. And I believe, as we look at the rest of the events of her life, she was a fast learner and incredibly adaptable. She may not have had the privileges or benefits of Catherine or Anne, but she was by no means stupid as far as I'm concerned. Many scholars assert that Jane Seymour entered Queen Catherine's household as one of her ladies in around 1529. If this is the case, then she would have been given a front row seat to that queen's waning position, her eventual fall, banishment, annulment, and replacement. Equally, she would have also seen the rise and later fall of that replacement, Anne Boleyn. As it currently stands, I can find no evidence of what Jane may have done or where she may have been between the exile of Catherine from court in 1531 and the recognition of Anne as queen in 1533. During this period, there was no queen at the English court for Jane to serve. If she had served Catherine, perhaps she returned to Wolf Hall, to wait for the dust to settle at court and to see what was to come next. Perhaps, however, she stayed and transferred into Anne's service to keep her company before she actually became queen. It's possible that it wasn't long before Jane Seymour became the focus for Henry's affection. A letter from Eustace Chapuis to the Emperor Charles V is dated to the 13th of October 1534, so that is the following year after Anne Boleyn's coronation. This letter includes the following information. Of late days, the Lord Rochford's wife, that's Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, has been banished the court because she conspired with the concubine, that's Chapuis's name for Anne Boleyn, to procure the withdrawal from court of the young lady whom this king has been accustomed to serve, whose influence increases daily, while that of the concubine diminishes, which has already abated a good deal of her insolence. The said young lady has of late sent to the princess, he is here referring to Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry and Katherine of Aragon, to tell her to be of good cheer, and that her troubles would sooner come to an end than she supposed, and that when the opportunity occurred, she would show herself her true and devoted servant. The young lady of Chapuis's letter is assumed by many to have been Jane Seymour. In September 1535, King Henry VIII honoured the Seymour family by visiting their ancestral home, Wolf Hall. The next year, on the 10th of February 1536, Chapuis wrote once again to Emperor Charles V, this time with news that Anne Boleyn had suffered a miscarriage on the 29th of January of that year. The 29th of January was also the date that Katherine of Aragon was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Chapuis informs his imperial master that, on the day of the interment, the concubine had an abortion, a miscarriage, which seemed to be a male child, which she had not borne 3.5 months, at which the king has shown great distress. The said concubine wished to lay the blame on the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, whom she hates, saying he frightened her by bringing the news of the fall the king had 6 days before. This is the king's jousting injury, that for some is a root source of a brain injury that might have altered his personality. But it is well known that is not the cause, for it was told her in a way that she should not be alarmed or attach much importance to it. Some think it was owing to her own incapacity to bear children. Others to a fear that the king would treat her like the late queen, especially considering the treatment shown to a lady of the court, named Mistress Seymour, to whom, as many say, he has lately made great presents. On the 1st of April, another missive from Chapuis to the emperor stated, "The king being lately in this town, and the young lady, Mistress Seymour, whom he serves at Greenwich, he sent her a purse full of sovereigns, and with it a letter. And that young lady, after kissing the letter, returned it unopened to the messenger, and throwing herself on her knees before him, begged the said messenger that he would pray the king on her part to consider that she was a gentlewoman of good and honourable parents without reproach, and that she had no greater riches in the world than her honour, which she would not injure for 1,000 deaths, and if he wished to make some present in money, she begged it might be when God enabled her to make some honourable match." Chapuis goes on, explaining that he has been informed that, by this, the king's love and desire towards the said lady was wonderfully increased, and that he had said she had behaved most virtuously, and to show her that he only loved her honourably, he did not intend henceforth to speak with her except in the presence of some of her kin. For which reason the king has caused Cromwell to remove from a chamber, to which the king can go by certain galleries without being perceived, and has lodged there the eldest brother of the said lady with his wife, in order to bring thither the same young lady, who has been well taught for the most part by those intimate with the king, who hate the concubine, that she must by no means comply with the king's wishes except by way of marriage, in which she is quite firm. She is also advised to tell the king boldly how his marriage is detested by the people, and none consider it lawful, and on the occasion when she shall bring forward the subject, there ought to be present none but titled persons, who will say the same if the king put them upon their oath of fealty. Anne Boleyn had supplanted the aunt of the Emperor Charles V, the man who Chapuis is writing to. Thus, it might be quite easy to dismiss a lot of this as propaganda. Chapuis looking for information that would please his master. Chapuis has spies at court, people who he is paying for information. Perhaps they will tell him what he wants to hear. But I think that probably doesn't ring very true. Rather, I think that Chapuis is going to be looking for the best, most reliable intelligence that money can buy. Certainly, he's going to be more interested if that intelligence relates to the failing marriage of Anne and Henry. But if he later finds it to be deceptive, he certainly won't pay that source for further intelligence. A man like Chapuis is reliant on the trustworthiness and honesty of his intelligence network at the English court. It's a network that he will have pruned and honed, one that he can trust. And for that reason, I would argue that we should perhaps also trust it. Anne Boleyn was sent to the Tower of London on the 2nd of May 1536. There she was confined, and there she was ultimately executed on the 19th of May 1536. On the day following Anne Boleyn's execution, the 20th of May 1536, King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour were betrothed. 10 days later, on the 30th of May 1536, Henry and Jane were married in a private ceremony in the Queen's closet at Whitehall Palace. Henry was finally in an undisputed marriage, because either way you slice it, Henry was now a widower and free to marry. He presented his new wife with expensive jewellery and also valuable jointures of lands and lordships. Jane's family also felt the benefit of her elevation. Her brothers Edward and Thomas were richly rewarded. Edward became Viscount Beauchamp in 1536, Earl of Hertford the next year, and also a Privy Councillor on the 22nd of May 1537. Thomas became a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and was knighted in 1537. Both brothers received generous grants of land from their brother-in-law, the king. Her sister Elizabeth was married to Gregory Cromwell, the son of the king's favoured counsellor and friend, at least he was at that time, Thomas Cromwell. Behind the scenes, Jane is said to have sought to bring about a reconciliation between her husband and her stepdaughter Mary. However persuasive she may have been, whatever she may have promised or tried, as it would turn out, the thing that would successfully bring father and daughter back together was only Mary's total submission, her absolute acknowledgement that her father had been right. She was made to agree that Henry was the head of the Church of England, and that she, of course, was a bastard, because naturally, Henry was right about that too. He had never been married to her mother. Jane is often presented as being conservative in matters of religion, but to my mind, this may simply be another way to show her as the antithesis of her predecessor, the reform-minded Anne Boleyn, because, as it stands, there is no evidence either way. The Seymour family's reforming interest and dedication to the Protestant faith would be a factor of a later decade. There is an oft-repeated rumour that in October 1536, Jane attempted to intercede on behalf of the Pilgrimage of Grace. By doing so, it is said that she also received a warning from her husband. He told her to not meddle in politics, and he used Anne Boleyn as an example and a threat. This rumour is, at least as far as I can tell, just that, a rumour. Jane fell pregnant early in 1537. She entered her confinement in her chambers at Hampton Court Palace in the September of that year, and in those rooms she was eventually delivered of her son, Prince Edward, in the early hours of the 12th of October. 3 days later, on the 15th of October, the infant Edward was baptised in a fittingly elaborate ceremony which took place in Hampton Court's Royal Chapel. Jane's health began to decline. We aren't quite sure what happened. Her illness may have been the result of an infection and/or the retention of part of her placenta. Despite the desperate and best efforts of all of those around her, Jane could not be saved. She died on the 24th of October, 1537. I'd like to look at another quote by Barrett L. Beer, who asserts that she, Jane, left for posterity an indelible impression of perfection, and was remembered by Henry as the wife with whom he had been uniquely happy. When Henry died in 1547, he was buried with Jane at Windsor. For me, Jane Seymour remains an enigma. It is, I think, all too easy to write her off as a bit of a wetty, a bit dull, less clever than those who came before her. Nothing more than a willing, biddable vessel for Henry Tudor's dynastic hopes. Indeed, credit for her rise is often placed on her obedience alone. To Henry, but also to the scheming men around her, father, brothers, cousins. I worry that all this perhaps conspires to leave Jane being remembered by history as little more than a pawn. A nice, weak, biddable, but ultimately quite dull and forgettable character. However, there is something about this that feels incomplete, hollow, perhaps even a little deceptive here. Because, as far as I'm concerned, Jane is too perfectly crafted as the diametric opposite to Anne Boleyn. Jane is fair, Anne brunette. Jane makes no attempt to push for a political or religious faction. Anne was a political animal and a motivated, outspoken reformer, who also always had one eye on her own personal advancement and the success of her family. Jane was compliant, Anne argumentative. Jane was demure, Anne was a flirt. Even if all we are seeing here are Jane's own natural traits, I think it's clear they are being at least somewhat amplified by her. Now, perhaps this is due to the guidance or even puppeteering of others, Whatever is going on, Jane plays her game deftly. She holds the line, and more tellingly for me, she holds her nerve. In Jane Seymour, we have a woman who has intimate, eyewitness knowledge of her future husband's capriciousness, of his willingness to discard his wives, occasionally in extraordinarily brutal ways. And as Chapuis's missives show, Jane was increasingly under near constant surveillance by spies paid by Chapuis and no doubt by countless others. Because of her position, Jane's behaviour had become the subject of international reports. Yet it seems that Jane doesn't falter, doesn't hesitate, doesn't blink, at least not in the sight of witnesses. Jane maintains her composure as her former mistress, a woman who she has lived and worked alongside for years, is arrested, tried, and eventually executed on the orders of her husband. The very next day after Anne's execution, through her betrothal to Henry, Jane simply takes another step towards filling Anne's barely cold seat. To me, this behaviour is evidence that we do Jane perhaps a great disservice by writing her off as nice and weak. I think she had a will of iron and a spine of steel, and perhaps the sufficient lack of empathy which increasingly seems to be a prerequisite for success. While this picture of her might make her a little bit less likeable, to my mind, it certainly makes her more multifaceted and therefore, arguably, more interesting. But what do you think? Who was Jane Seymour as far as you're concerned? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversation in the comment section underneath this video. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. I'll leave links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you found this video interesting and useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel, and while you're there, hit the notification bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. And also on that note, I have been told that people are finding themselves being unsubscribed to this channel. So if you think you're subscribed, you want to be, why not take this moment to have a little check? Go down, check out the button, see if you are subscribed. And while you're there, make sure you've also clicked that bell if you haven't already. I do hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.